who's mowing their lawn right now? I think we'd all have that one neighbor who would be. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2020 thriller, She Dies Tomorrow, which will be released on VOD on August 7th. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, ranked lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. She Dies Tomorrow stars Sheil, Jane Adams, and Chris Messina, and was directed by Seimetz. It tells the story of Amy, played by Sheil, who's overcome by the feeling that she's gonna die tomorrow, and this assertion of hers has a radiating effect on the people she interacts with. It's always an interesting experience going into a movie you know next to nothing about. Even more so when that viewing isn't preceded by months of hype coming out of the film festival circuit. This movie was set to premiere at South by Southwest back in March, but after that got cancelled, it never had a chance to garner any buzz. And honestly, I prefer that, because it means I had no expectations going in. It had nothing to live up to in my mind besides the interest that the single-sentence logline had generated for me. And that was a good thing, because this would have been so incredibly disappointing had I been excited for it. I mean, even with no expectations, this was pretty disappointing. This movie is absolutely glacial in its pacing. Now, I've got nothing against slow burn movies. With the right combination of story and character and outcome, slow burns can be amazingly satisfying experiences. But a slow burn needs to be burning. It doesn't have to be a raging fire, but you at least need to have some hot coals to keep it going. This film was just barely smoking, and you sit there waiting for something, some sort of build-up, but it just takes so long to get going, and even when it's finally going, it's not doing all that much. I gotta say, I'm extremely happy this movie is under an hour and a half, because even with such a short runtime, it felt like a tedious chore to get through. In addition to the pacing, another big contributing factor to the tediousness of this film was the style. I know there are a lot of people who like very esoteric experimental films, but I'm not one of them. And I hate to throw another overused critic phrase at you after saying slow burn earlier, but there's no way around it. She Dies Tomorrow is the epitome of style over substance. In fact, there's really no true substance to this one at all. There's an idea and a theme, which I'll talk about in a second, but there isn't much of a plot, which is hard for me, because I'm very much a plot person, and I can be forgiving of meandering, mostly plotless films if they have good characters, but this movie doesn't have any of those either. There are only a handful of characters in this story, and for most of them, we get only the most surface-level characterization, so I never found myself connecting with or caring about a single person in this film. So if there isn't a plot and there aren't really characters, what does this film have? Like I was alluding to earlier, it does have its own style. It's not a style I particularly liked, but I'm sure it's something that some people will enjoy. It's fairly experimental, often cutting between very mundane situations and seemingly random visual imagery. We get a lot of colorful, flashing neon lights coming out of nowhere, some random microscopy imagery, artsy, out-of-focus shots, the repetition of classical music, and a ton of frustratingly abrupt transitions. So rather than a plot or characters, this movie is more of an encapsulation of a feeling, specifically anxiety. And so I think the imagery and sounds are trying to capture and represent this feeling of anxiety, but at least for me, it just doesn't do a good job of it. And this idea of anxiety brings me to the film's premise, which I think had a lot of potential. The main theme of this film, or its central thesis if you will, is that anxiety and fear can be incredibly contagious. That even the people who seem outwardly the most well-adjusted can be impacted by it. Once a seed of doubt is planted in somebody's mind, it can be consuming, to the point that it's the only thing they can think about anymore. And so even though it takes about 50 minutes to get to this point, I think the film does a really good job of representing that concept. I just wish it actually did something with it. So I think this movie's gonna be a pretty divisive one because of how atypical it is. I have a feeling I'm gonna be in the minority of critics on this one, since these very experimental, feeling-driven films tend to be critically lauded. But I don't see this being a movie that general audiences will enjoy. It seems to be a very personal representation of anxiety, and if your anxiety manifests in a different way, it's gonna be very hard to connect with. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The only real pro here was the central theme and premise. I really liked the idea of this movie, and I thought it did a good job of showing the contagiousness and transmission of fear, but there wasn't anything to it beyond that concept and general feeling. It had a lot of potential, but just didn't do anything with it. I kept waiting for something to happen, some climax to the incredibly slow and minor buildup, but it just doesn't go anywhere. As it stands, without any real plot or characters, I think this could have made a pretty decent short film, but there's just not enough there to warrant stretching this out to feature film length. On the con side, the biggest issue is that there's no substance to this film. There's not really a plot, and whatever hint of a story is there isn't developed beyond its most basic concepts. So we end up with a movie where nothing really happens. And that can work if you've got interesting characters to focus in on, but this movie's lacking there too. And so it ends up becoming more of an artistic exercise to capture a feeling than anything else. The second con is the pacing. Oh man, is this a slow movie. And that in itself isn't a deal-breaker quality in a film for me, but when combined with the first con, it's brutal. With an artsy movie like this, you expect some elongated, esoteric weirdness in the beginning, but it just kind of stays at that level. It takes so long for this movie to get going. It's beyond the halfway mark when the premise finally starts to take shape, and like I said before, it never really ramps up to much of anything. And so even though the movie's only 84 minutes long, it stagnates without a plot and feels much, much longer. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying any of the films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give She Dies Tomorrow 1.5 out of 5 paws. Without much of a plot or even remotely developed characters, this movie relies on connecting with people based on a feeling, and I just did not feel that connection. I would recommend She Dies Tomorrow to people who like experimental, emotion-driven films. This movie's got a basic concept, but the characters are all presented fairly superficially, and there's really no true plot to speak of. To be honest, it feels like something A24 would have put out, so if you like their more esoteric, meandering films, you might appreciate this one. If you liked She Dies Tomorrow, I would recommend It Comes at Night. It's a fairly esoteric A24 thriller that explores human nature and the concept of fear in a scenario of near constant foreboding dread. If you want another movie about fear transmission that's a bit more plot-driven, you might want to check out It Follows. It's a more standard movie than this is, but it's still a bit more elevated than your typical horror fare. And much like this film, the dread it focuses on is actually a representation of a specific type of fear. And if you like the concept of a movie about knowing when you're gonna die, but want something a bit more plot-driven, you should watch The Ring. Not only does it explore the death concept, but it also gets into the idea of this being a spreadable, contagious piece of information. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen She Dies Tomorrow? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's a movie that you think would have worked better as a short film? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information on this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.